This is a video for CS140, the Kino Lab. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about specifically the product.cpp file that you need to submit. And in this video in particular, I'm going to be talking about all of the functions except the print function and the calculate product function. So except the print function and the calculate product function. All right. So also, I'm assuming that you have looked through the lab write-up and have read it thoroughly, because I'm not going to explain like what numerator and denominator means or go over anything that has already been talked about in the write-up. So let's get started. First off, I'm going to start with talking about the multiply number function and the divide number function. So multiply and divide number functions that both take int in, and they both are void functions. So for using these functions, I made a helper function. And I called that helper function resize helper. Because if you take a look at the lab write-up, the description for multiply and divide number is very, very simple. It says you need to make sure that n is an index in your numerator and denominator respectively. And as long as it's indexed in there, so that means really that the numerator and denominator are large enough in size, then all you have to do is increment numerator or increment denominator depending on the function. So I used this resize helper to, one, check if n was an index in the numerator and denominator, and resize if necessary. So resize the numerator or denominator if it wasn't. Resize if necessary. In this helper function, I always kept the numerator and denominator the same, just because that helps out later when you're canceling these numbers out. You don't have to check, oh, is the numerator vector smaller than the denominator vector so I don't go out of bounds and da-da-da-da-da. I just always kept them both the same size, and that made it easier for me later on the road. So this helper function, since it's not part of the product class, you can't access numerator and denominator unless you pass them as parameters to resize helper. And because we actually want to change the structure of these vectors potentially, you need to pass them by reference. So just as a quick reminder, the function signature for this resize helper, it's going to be a void function too, and you'll want to write it as such, a vector of ints, and then remember to use the ampersand symbol for passing by reference, and then numerator, and do the same thing for denominator, and then of course you'll want to pass in, and in refers to this n right here. We're going to see if that n, let's say it's 3, we need to make sure that the numerator and denominator both have 3 as an index, and if not, we need to resize it. All right, so once that is written, multiply and divide number become really easy. So these functions, we're going to talk about them right here. They become really, really easy and just as simple as it sounds in the write-up. You're going to call the helper function here, and then you simply increment numerator sub I or denominator sub I, like the lab write-up says. That's it, just like a two-liner function. Super easy. All right, so next let's talk about multiply factorial and divide factorial. So, spelling everything wrong today. Multiply and divide factorial, which also takes an int n. So this is also a very short function as well. So you can use multiply and divide number inside multiply and divide factorial. You can use work you've already done. So this just should be very short. I can't really say a whole lot about it, or I'd just completely give it away. It's that short. If you're really stuck and it's just confusing you, one hint that you can think about is you will have to have a loop. So you need a loop here. I'm not going to say what kind of loop, how the loop ends, whatnot, but if you're really stuck, think about using a loop. All right, so moving on to multiply binomial and divide binomial. Multiply binomial and divide binomial. This takes an int n and an int k. So just a quick reminder that this is representing this mathematical equation. So n factorial divided by k factorial times n minus k factorial. That's what this is going to represent. The multiply binomial specifically represents this equation. Divide binomial represents the inverse of this. So really I'm just going to be referencing multiply binomial the whole time so I can be referencing this equation. Divide is very, very, very similar. It's just the inverse of this. So this should be solely composed of function calls that you have already made. And a hint, it should be 3 lines long. So solely composed of function calls to functions you have already made. If you're having trouble figuring out what those function calls should be in what order, go back to this equation and think about it step by step. So I'm going to talk about this over here. So if we're thinking about this step by step, let's just isolate this right here. This is n factorial. So think about how you would calculate n factorial. And then I'm going to write this out slightly different than what I've circled here, but mathematically it's still exactly the same. So once we have the answer to n factorial, let's divide that by k factorial. Think about how you would take something and then divide it by k factorial. Once you have that done, let's call this a, just so I can reference it as a single variable. A is going to stand for like answer I have so far. So after you've done those two mathematical equations, now we're going to take the answer we have so far and we are going to divide it by n minus k factorial. So how would we do that? Think about that. So I broke that up into 3 steps. First step is think about how to do n factorial. Second step is, okay, take that answer, figure out how do I divide by k factorial. Okay, take that answer, how do I divide that answer by n minus k factorial. So that is multiply binomial, divide binomial, same thought process, only again, the equation is inverted. And lastly, let's talk about the invert function and clear function. So for the invert function, this is just a simple swap procedure. So you should be very familiar with swap procedures at this point, I hope. If it's been a little while, just a reminder that in a swap procedure, you need a temporary variable to do the swap. And the clear function is simply just zeroing everything out, clearing, just like it says. So this is just clearing so you can restart any calculations. Clearing, just as simple as it sounds. Just as simple as it sounds. All right, so again, this is the Kino Lab product.cpp. I will talk about the print function and the calculate product function in another video that you can also see here on YouTube. Thanks.